Did you know that America's bloodiest conflict wasn't just about slavery? The Civil War was a fight for something much deeper, an identity that would define the future of a nation. But here's the twist: even after the war ended, the real battle for freedom and equality was far from over. Stick around, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the Civil War and its legacy. You won't want to miss this. Keep watching, and let's dive into the untold story. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. In the heart of a divided nation, on the eve of the bloodiest conflict America would ever know, a story unfolds, one of struggle, sacrifice, and a relentless fight for the very soul of a country. The American Civil War, often reduced to a clash between North and South freedom and slavery, was, in truth, far more complicated, far more personal, and far more profound than it is often presented. It wasn't just the battle of ideas or even the clash of economies. It was a story of families torn apart, of ideals broken and remade, and of an entire nation at war with itself in a desperate attempt to define its future. The simplistic narrative we often hear is that the war was about the North's fight for freedom and the South's defense of slavery. But to reduce it to that would be to miss the very human heart of the conflict. This was not merely a political battle. It was a battle of identity, of culture, of power, and yes, of human lives. Scene: a family at dinner in a Southern household. The father speaks to his children. As they listen in silence, narrator voiceover. Picture this: a father sitting at his dinner table in Charleston, South Carolina, explaining to his children why the Union must not be allowed to tear apart the way they've lived for generations. He speaks of states' rights, of a Southern way of life, of honor and tradition. But beneath his words, behind his carefully chosen arguments, lies a more painful truth: slavery. It is not simply a system of labor. It is the bedrock of his world, the foundation upon which his prosperity, his family's future, and his sense of security are built. In the North, the debate raged differently. The war was often seen as a moral crusade, a chance to do what was right. But even in the North, the battle was not solely about abolition. It was about preserving the Union, about proving that a nation founded on democratic ideals could survive a test of its integrity. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, thousands of families sent their sons to fight for a cause they saw as one of unity, not just the end of slavery. Seeing soldiers lining up for battle, the clashing sound of weapons in the distance. Narrator, voiceover, and so they marched into battle, not just for their country, but for the future of their families, their communities, and the ideals they believed in. The sound of cannon fire and the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh were the price they paid for a future that, in many ways, none of them could have imagined. But what the history books often fail to tell us is that in the heat of battle, it wasn't simply a fight over an abstract issue like states' rights or abolition. It was a war of survival, of dignity. It was a war that forced men and women to confront the reality of what it meant to be human, to understand the consequences of their actions on the lives of others. And in the process, the war tested not just the nation's political will, but its moral foundation. Scene: a hospital tent, soldiers wounded and dying, their faces etched with fear and pain. Narrator, voiceover. On the battlefields, the horror of war was personal. For those who fought, it was not simply about the grand ideals of liberty and justice. It was about the men they fought beside, the comrades who fell beside them, and the blood that soaked the earth beneath them. It was about the women who nursed the wounded, and the families who waited at home, unaware of the fate that would await their sons and husbands. Imagine the heartbreak of a mother in the South, hearing of her son's death at the hands of Union soldiers. The same heartbreak felt by a Northern father, learning that his son, a private in the Union Army, had been taken prisoner and left to die in a Confederate prison camp. These were not just numbers. They were people, lives lost in the name of a cause that would reshape a nation. Seeing the aftermath of war, devastated landscapes, ruined homes, and the sound of soldiers returning. Narrator, voiceover. When the war ended, when the Confederate flag was lowered for the last time, the wounds of the nation ran deep. The war may have been won, but the division, the animosity, and the scars of violence lingered long after. The stories of loss, of families divided, of soldiers who would never return home. They would echo for generations, but the war also gave birth to something else: the promise of a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to redefine what it meant to be an American. In the rubble of the Confederacy, In the fields where men once fought and bled, there was an opportunity to create a more just and unified nation. It was a promise that would be tested again and again. But the Civil War marked the first step in that long journey, a journey that, while not perfect, would move America toward its ultimate ideals of freedom and equality. Seen, the Lincoln Memorial at sunset, the figure of Abraham Lincoln standing solemnly, gazing out over the National Mall. Narrator, voiceover, and yet in the end, the Civil War was not just a war of bullets and blood. It was a war of ideas, a war for the soul of a nation. It was about what America could become and what it could not afford to be. In the years that followed, the story of the Civil War became the story of America's redemption. The struggle to fulfill the promise of freedom, the long, painful journey toward equality, the fight to live up to the ideals written in the Declaration of Independence, where all men are created equal. And so, as we look back on that moment in history, let us not simplify it. Let us not reduce it to a battle between good and evil, or between the North and South. Let us remember that the Civil War was a fight between what was and what could have been, a struggle that changed the course of American history and set in motion a path that we are still walking today. Closing music, soft, reflective, with the sound of distant winds, signifying the passing of time and the endurance of history. The American Civil War was often simplified as a fight between two regions, the North and the South, with clear-cut issues of slavery and state sovereignty. But to view it only through the lens of these two concepts is to miss the true depth of what the war represented. The conflict was, at its core, a battle for identity. It was about who the American people were, who they wanted to be, and how they saw their nation. For the North and South, the war was not just about the political structures or economic systems that each region espoused. It was a struggle over the very essence of what it meant to be American. In the South, the identity was deeply intertwined with an agrarian, slave-based economy that had been in place for generations. Southern society was built on a rigid class structure, with an aristocratic elite at the top, followed by a mass of poor whites and enslaved African Americans at the bottom. Slavery was not just an economic institution, it was the foundation of the South's social order and worldview. For Southern leaders, their way of life was under attack. They viewed the Union's efforts to restrict the expansion of slavery and limit its power as a direct threat to their culture, their values, and perhaps most importantly, their very identity. The South prided itself on a sense of honor, tradition, and chivalric values, which they saw as being under siege by the industrialized, rapidly modernizing North. To them, the Union's push for a more egalitarian society, founded on industrial capitalism and the ideals of free labor, represented a betrayal of everything they stood for. For many Southerners, the question was not merely one of slavery, but of sovereignty and self-determination. The Southern states felt that their cultural and economic systems were vastly different from those of the North, and they saw themselves as being in direct opposition to the Union's increasing centralization of power. The notion of states' rights, the idea that individual states should have the ability to govern themselves without interference from the federal government, was central to Southern identity. They saw the Union as overstepping its bounds by attempting to impose its will on them, particularly when it came to the issue of slavery. For them, this was not just a political issue, it was a matter of existential importance. They believed that the Union, as it was being shaped, no longer represented their vision of America. In the North, the question of identity was also fraught with complexity. While the North is often portrayed as a bastion of freedom, the truth is that many Northerners add their own complex and sometimes contradictory views on slavery, race, and what it meant to be American. The North had abolished slavery earlier than the South, but it was by no means free from its own entanglements with racial prejudice. While some Northern states were home to strong abolitionist movements, the majority of Northerners were not deeply invested in the immediate eradication of slavery. Many saw the war as a means to preserve the Union, not necessarily to end slavery. Even among those who opposed slavery, there was often a fear of what the emancipation of African Americans would mean for the social order, especially in terms of racial integration. In the industrialized North, where economic and social change was already in full swing, the growing debate over the expansion of slavery was seen not just as an ideological issue, but as a fundamental challenge to the future of the nation's political and economic systems. Northern identity was also shaped by the ideas of free labor and the opportunities that were available to those who could work in the expanding industrial economy. For many Northerners, the idea of a society based on wage labor, where anyone could rise up from humble beginnings, was central to their vision of the American dream. This was a sharp contrast to the Southern model, where wealth was often inherited and rooted in the ownership of land and human beings. The North's sense of American identity was bound up in the idea that hard work and individual effort could lead to success, and that all men, regardless of their birth, should have the opportunity to pursue that success. The moral weight of slavery was certainly part of the Northern narrative, but so too was the vision of a nation that would thrive economically and socially without the stain of human bondage. However, it was not only the economic differences between the North and the South that defined their opposing identities. The war was also a battle over the political philosophy that each region represented. The North, with its industrial economy and growing urban population, saw itself as aligned with the progressive forces of history. It viewed its vision of a free labor economy as the future of the nation and the world. In contrast, the South saw itself as a bastion of tradition, one that was rooted in an agrarian economy and a hierarchical social order. It was in many ways a vision of the past, a society that clung to old ways, even as the world around it changed. The conflict then was not just about which side would control the future of slavery, but which model of America would shape the nation moving forward. For both the North and the South, their sense of identity was inextricably tied to their vision of what America could be. The war forced each side to confront the question of whether their vision could coexist within the same union. The battle over slavery became the most pressing issue, but it was not the only issue. It was about the direction of the nation, the values that would guide its future, and the place of different groups within the broader American project. The Civil War was, in a very real sense, a fight for the soul of America, a struggle over what the nation could and should become. The deeper layers of this identity struggle were particularly evident in the cultural and emotional aspects of the war. For both sides, the war was about defending what they believed to be the true essence of America. The North fought to preserve a union that was becoming increasingly centralized, modern, and industrial. The South fought to preserve a vision of America that was decentralized, agrarian, and based on a strict social hierarchy. Both sides believed that their way of life was under threat, and the war itself was a manifestation of their desire to protect their respective identities. The war also forced Americans to confront their own hypocrisies and contradictions. For many in the North, the fight against slavery was bound up in a sense of moral righteousness. But even as they fought to abolish slavery, they were forced to reckon with their own complicity in a system that had, for years, allowed the dehumanization of African Americans. The abolition of slavery, while a moral victory, did not immediately resolve the racial tensions that had existed in the country. Similarly, for the South, the war was about defending their way of life, but it also revealed deep cracks in the idea of a superior, God-ordained system. The inability of the South to preserve its way of life ultimately led to the collapse of the old social order and forced the South to reevaluate its identity in the face of defeat. Both sides were caught in a battle for their own definition of Americanism, one that was shaped by their cultural, political, and economic realities. Each side's sense of identity was inextricably linked to the other, and the war itself was a contest to define what it meant to be American in the most fundamental way. It was not just a war for control of territory or resources. It was a war for the heart and soul of a nation. The American Civil War was more than just a conflict between two opposing armies. It was a deeply personal struggle that affected not only soldiers, but families, communities, and individuals in ways that are often overlooked in the broad narratives of history. The war touched lives in the most intimate and profound ways. The sacrifices made were not abstract or theoretical. They were felt in the bones of every person who had a stake in the outcome. In both the North and the South, the war tore apart families, divided communities, and left emotional scars that would last for generations. For many families in the South, the Civil War was a direct assault on their way of life. It was not simply about defending slavery or preserving an economy. It was about defending everything they knew and everything they valued. Southern women, in particular, found themselves caught in an unfamiliar world as their men went off to war. They became the backbone of a fragile economy, managing farms, plantations, and households in the absence of their husbands, fathers, and brothers. For some, this meant taking on responsibilities they had never imagined, overseeing agricultural production, caring for enslaved people who were caught in the crossfire of the war, and keeping the home front together in an environment of constant uncertainty. These women, often romanticized as the Southern Belles, were in reality thrust into the brutal realities of war and loss. Many had to deal with the emotional toll of seeing their loved ones march off to battle, unsure whether they would return home. When letters arrived from the front lines, they were often filled with news of battle, injury, or death. The letters written by soldiers or those who witnessed the carnage carried with them a sense of hopelessness, a sense that the world they had known was being destroyed. For a Southern mother receiving a letter that her son had been killed at Gettysburg or Chickamauga, the grief was profound, but it was also shared. In many cases, entire families lost multiple sons, fathers, and brothers. The magnitude of personal loss was staggering, and it left emotional scars that would shape the South for generations. In the North, the war was similarly personal, though the reasons for involvement were often different. Many Northern families had sons who enlisted for reasons other than moral opposition to slavery. In many cases, young men went to war because they felt it was their duty to preserve the Union. They believed in the idea of a united America and were willing to risk everything to ensure that the ideals of democracy and freedom could survive. But even in the North, the causes of war were not always simple. Many soldiers who enlisted were motivated by a complex combination of patriotism, economic necessity, and personal ambition. The lure of adventure, the promise of a steady paycheck, and the hope of securing a better future for their families were compelling factors. For families in the North, the war was also a time of uncertainty, as husbands and sons went off to fight, often leaving their wives and daughters to fend for themselves. The emotional strain on Northern families was immense. Women, too, had to take on new responsibilities. Many worked in factories, sewing clothes, producing weapons, and contributing to the war effort. They also became caretakers of soldiers, volunteering as nurses and tending to the wounded in makeshift hospitals. While many women found a sense of purpose in these roles, it was also a deeply painful experience as they watched their loved ones suffer in ways that were unimaginable before the war. In cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, hospitals were overcrowded with soldiers who had been maimed, wounded, or left broken by the horrors of battle. The emotional weight of caring for these soldiers, who often suffered from untreated psychological wounds, fell heavily on the women who volunteered their time. The emotional toll of the war was also felt in the communities that bore witness to the brutality of the conflict. Towns and cities in both the North and the South were transformed by the war. Communities that had once been filled with the sound of children playing in the streets, of neighbors talking over the fence, now became eerily quiet. Young men marched off to war, and the women and children who remained behind lived with the fear that their loved ones would never return. Every telegram that came through brought the potential for bad news, and the reality of those telegrams was harsh. The war was a constant reminder of loss and the uncertainty of the future. People saw their hometowns become places of military encampments, battlefields, and hospitals. These towns, once centers of community life, were now scarred by the violence that had unfolded on their streets. The emotional strain of war also created fractures within families. In some cases, brothers found themselves fighting on opposite sides of the conflict. The story of the Mudd brothers, one of whom fought for the Union and the other for the Confederacy, was a common tragedy. Families were torn apart by differing beliefs about the war and what it stood for. A father who had raised his sons in the values of the South could find himself heartbroken when one son left to join the Confederate Army and the other joined the Union cause. Such divisions were heartbreaking, as families who had once shared the same values were now on opposite sides of the greatest moral and political divide in American history. The war also revealed the deep emotional and psychological toll that combat took on soldiers. It is often difficult for those who did not experience war firsthand to understand the profound effects it has on those who fight. For soldiers in the Civil War, the brutality of the battlefield, the constant threat of death, and the emotional strain of losing comrades were constant companions. The term shell shock had not yet been coined, But the trauma of war was already deeply felt by soldiers who came home physically whole but emotionally scarred. The PTSD that many soldiers experienced, though not recognized at the time, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the war dragged on, soldiers often found themselves grappling with feelings of helplessness and despair. The endless marches, the constant fighting, and the ever-present threat of death took their toll. Some soldiers struggled to reconcile the ideals they had been taught to believe in with the reality they encountered on the battlefield. They had enlisted to fight for freedom, for democracy, for justice. But the horrors they witnessed often left them questioning everything they had been told. The emotional burden of war weighed heavily on the minds of these young men, many of whom would return home unable to process things they had seen. The women and families who supported the soldiers also dealt with their own form of trauma. The constant anxiety of waiting for word from the front, the uncertainty about whether their loved ones would return home, and the emotional strain of living in a society that was increasingly fragmented and torn apart by war took a toll on their mental health. Many mothers lost more than one son, while wives were left to raise children alone or manage households that had been disrupted by the war. The emotional strain of these experiences often went unacknowledged, as society at the time was more focused on the physical battles of the war than the psychological wounds that it left behind. Communities, too, were not immune to the emotional effects of the war. Towns in the South, in particular, were ravaged by the destruction of war. Entire towns were burned to the ground, and families found themselves homeless, living in constant fear of military occupation or raids. In the North, the war brought economic hardship. As businesses were disrupted, farms went untended, and families struggled to make ends meet. Communities that had once been united by shared values now found themselves divided as people questioned the loyalty of their neighbors. In the midst of the chaos, people were forced to reckon with the personal, emotional costs of the war, the loss of life, the destruction of homes, and the disintegration of families. Throughout the Civil War, the emotional landscape of both the North and the South was shaped by the constant threat of loss and the ever-present reality of death. The war, which seemed like an external conflict on the surface, was deeply internalized by the people who lived through it. They fought not just for political or economic causes, but for their own sense of identity, for the preservation of their way of life, and for the future of their children. The emotional impact of the war went far beyond the battlefield, seeping into the hearts and minds of those who were left to pick up the pieces of a broken nation. The Civil War was not only a conflict of ideologies, nor merely a battle fought by soldiers in uniform. It was also a fight for survival, a test of endurance, resilience, and, above all, the human spirit. For those who enlisted, the war quickly became a matter of life and death, not just for abstract causes like Union preservation or the abolition of slavery, but for their own survival, for the survival of their comrades, and for the chance to return home to a life that, for many, was irrevocably changed. The soldiers who fought in the war were not mere pawns in a political game. They were real people, forced to confront the brutal realities of war on a daily basis. They fought not just for the ideals they'd been told to believe in, but for their own dignity, their humanity, and for the bonds they formed with those around them. The early days of the war saw an outpouring of patriotic fervor. Men enlist eagerly, motivated by a sense of duty, idealism, and the desire to be part of a grand cause. Many had never been far from home, had never seen the horrors of battle, and were, at least initially, eager for the adventure that war seemed to promise. But soon, that naivete was shattered by the brutality of combat. What they found on the front lines was not the glory of battle they had imagined, but the suffocating fear of death, the constant presence of bloodshed, and the utter devastation of their bodies and minds. For many soldiers, the first battle was a harrowing introduction to the true nature of war. The carnage of places like Antietam and Gettysburg was beyond anything they had prepared for, and it left an indelible mark on the psyche of those who survived. For soldiers on both sides, the most immediate and pressing concern was survival. The idea of serving a higher cause was often overshadowed by the more personal, primal need to make it through each day. In the trenches, soldiers faced a constant barrage of bullets, artillery shells, and disease. The terrain was often muddy, cold, and unsanitary, and food was scarce. The threat of death was ever present, and many soldiers were forced to confront their own mortality on a daily basis. In these conditions, the sense of comradeship that developed among soldiers became one of the most important elements of survival. For many, the bonds formed with their fellow soldiers were what kept them going through the darkest moment. These men relied on each other for physical and emotional support, and their survival often depended on their ability to trust and rely on one another in the heat of battle. One of the most striking aspects of the Civil War was the sheer scale of the violence. Battle after battle claimed thousands of lives, often with little to show for it in terms of territorial gain or strategic advantage. The constant loss of life, the constant barrage of death, left soldiers with a sense of futility. Many came to see the war not as a noble struggle for freedom or union, but as a grinding, hopeless conflict that seemed to offer no end. In many cases, soldiers fought in multiple battles over the course of the war, each one seeming just as brutal and unforgiving as the last. Over time, the emotional toll of constant combat wore down even the most resilient soldiers. The physical wounds were one thing, amputations, shrapnel wounds, and gaping cuts, but the psychological wounds were far harder to heal. The trauma of combat, the sights and sounds of battle stayed with soldiers long after they left the front lines. The term shell shock had not yet been coined, but many soldiers experienced what we now know to be PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, and an inability to reintegrate into civilian life. For many, the emotional toll of war became overwhelming. The idea of fighting for a higher cause often gave way to a desire to simply stay alive. Men who had initially enlisted out of a sense of duty or loyalty to their cause found themselves questioning the reasons for the war itself. The horrors of war forced many soldiers to confront not only the physical reality of violence, but also the moral ambiguity of the situation. Many soldiers were deeply troubled by the idea of killing other men, especially when those men were fighting for similar causes. The soldiers on both sides were fighting for what they believed was right, yet the cost was staggering. For some, the war seemed pointless, a waste of life that left only destruction in its wake. In the face of such overwhelming challenges, the will to survive was often the only thing that kept soldiers going. There was a fierce determination, a gut-level drive to live that transcended the ideals of the war. The soldiers knew that for many of them, survival was a matter of luck as much as it was of skill or bravery. Yet it was more than just chance that determined who made it through the war and who did not. The bonds of brotherhood, the shared experiences of battle, and the deep emotional connection between soldiers often played a crucial role in ensuring their survival. Soldiers learned to watch each other's backs, to share what little they had, and to comfort each other in times of grief and loss. These relationships were the emotional backbone of survival. They gave soldiers a reason to keep fighting, even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. The war also put soldiers in a position where they had to make key, difficult, sometimes life-altering decisions. The decision to fight, to continue pushing forward in the face of overwhelming odds, was not always an easy one. Soldiers had to come to terms with the fact that they might not survive the war. They had to accept the possibility that they would never see their families again, that they would never return to the lives they had known. In some cases, soldiers were forced to make decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the heat of battle, they might have been forced to choose between saving their own lives or saving the lives of their comrades. These decisions were not always clear-cut, and the emotional weight of them could be crushing. The experience of war also altered the way soldiers viewed their place in the world. For many, the war was a rite of passage, a moment of personal transformation. They went into the war as young, idealistic men and emerged from it as hardened veterans, scarred by their experiences. The war exposed them to the worst aspects of human nature, the violence, the hatred, the suffering. But it also revealed the best, the resilience, the courage, the kindness that soldiers showed to one another in the midst of unimaginable suffering was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. In some ways, the war gave them a new sense of identity. They were no longer just young men from farms or factories. They were survivors shaped by the experiences they had shared with their fellow soldiers. For many soldiers, the end of the war did not mark the end of their struggle. The war may have ended with the signing of the peace treaties and the return to civilian life, but the emotional scars it left behind would never heal completely. For those who survived, the war was a defining experience, one that shaped their identity for the rest of their lives. They returned home as different people, haunted by the memories of the war, burdened by the emotional weight of what they had seen and done. The war had changed them in ways that were impossible to articulate. The battlefields might have been far behind them, but the emotional aftermath was something they would carry with them forever. The aftermath of the Civil War was a time of immense transformation, but it was also a period of deep and lasting scars, both for the nation as a whole and for the individuals who had lived through the conflict. While the Union victory brought the promise of a reunited nation, the true cost of the war was not simply in the lives lost or the land destroyed, but in the emotional, psychological, and social toll it left behind. The war had irrevocably changed the country, and the process of rebuilding, of reconstructing both the South and the nation's identity would prove to be far more difficult than anticipated. One of the most immediate effects of the war was the loss of life. Over 600,000 soldiers died, and the true number of civilian casualties, particularly in the South, is difficult to quantify. The magnitude of the deaths was not just a number. It was a devastating reality that shattered families and communities. Entire generations were lost, and the trauma of this loss would echo for decades. For the mothers who had lost sons, the wives who had lost husbands, and the children who had lost fathers. The war's end did not bring closure. The homes that had been torn apart by the war were left with an empty, painful silence. The grief that had been felt during the war lingered, and it became a defining feature of the post-war South. The South, in particular, faced an unimaginable challenge in rebuilding its economy and society. The Confederacy had been devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, its economy in ruins, and its people grappling with the collapse of the social order they had known for centuries. The once proud plantation economy, built on the backs of enslaved people, was no longer viable. The labor system that had sustained the South's wealth and social hierarchy was gone, and with it went the Southern elite's vision of their place in the world. The wealth that had been concentrated in the hands of a few now seemed like a distant dream. The economic collapse forced many Southern families to adapt in ways they had never imagined. The promise of Reconstruction brought hope, but also uncertainty. Many Southerners, particularly those of the upper class, resented the imposition of federal policies and felt humiliated by their loss. The idea of submitting to Northern authority was seen as a bitter pill to swallow, and some, especially in rural areas, resisted change at all costs. But the most profound transformation in the South was the social upheaval that followed emancipation. The abolition of slavery had freed millions of African Americans, but the road to true freedom was fraught with obstacles. Former slaves, now freedmen, had to navigate a world that was still hostile to their existence. While they were legally free, the reality of their lives was often one of oppression, discrimination, and poverty. Many of them found themselves trapped in a system of sharecropping where they worked the land they once tilled. As slaves, but with far fewer rights and protections. The promise of land and liberty, given to former slaves by Union generals during the war, was often reneged upon, and they found themselves at the mercy of a racist system that sought to maintain the status quo of white supremacy. For white Southerners, the loss of their way of life was a bitter pill to swallow. Many of them clung to the ideals of the Confederacy, believing that they had been betrayed by both their own leadership and by the North. Their resentment was not just directed at the federal government, but also at the newly freed African Americans, whom they saw as a threat to their social order. The idea of racial superiority that had underpinned the South's social structure was deeply ingrained in their worldview, and the war's outcome forced them to reckon with a new, uncomfortable reality. The rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan was a direct response to the perceived threat posed by the end of slavery and the shift in the balance of power. These groups used terror and violence to try to maintain white control over Southern society, and their actions sowed seeds of division and hatred that would continue to poison race relations in the South for generations. The war's aftermath also forced a painful reckoning for the North. While the Union had won, the cost of victory had been steep. The emotional toll on Northern soldiers and their families was no less significant than that of the South. For many, the return to civilian life after years of war was difficult, if not impossible. The soldiers who had fought in the war returned home with physical and emotional scars that they struggled to reconcile. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, yet there was little understanding or support for their struggles. They were expected to reintegrate into society, to pick up the pieces of their old lives, but they were not the same men who had left. The psychological wounds of war were often ignored or misunderstood, leaving many veterans to suffer in silence. For the North, too, the war raised questions about the future of the nation. While the abolition of slavery was celebrated as a moral victory, it also left a sense of ambiguity about what the country was becoming. The war had been fought to preserve the Union, but now that the Union was intact, what was the role of African Americans in this new America? The question of equality had not been resolved with the Emancipation Proclamation or the passage of the 13th Amendment. The Reconstruction period, which sought to rebuild the South and integrate African Americans into society, was filled with contradictions. The North, despite its moral stance on slavery, struggled with its own racial prejudices and many Northern politicians, and citizens were reluctant to push for true racial equality. The fight for civil rights was just beginning, but the road ahead was long and fraught with opposition. As the war faded into memory, its impact continued to shape the national psyche. The Civil War, in its destruction and its transformation, had forced America to confront its own ideals, its own values, and its own identity. The nation had been tested, and in many ways it had failed. While slavery was abolished and the Union was preserved, the promises of freedom, equality, and justice were not fully realized. The deep divides that had been exposed during the war, the racial, political, and cultural divides, were not easily healed. For African Americans, the promise of freedom was still elusive. For white Southerners, the war's legacy was a deep sense of bitterness and resentment. And for the nation as a whole, the war raised difficult questions about what it truly meant to be American. The process of national healing was slow and uneven. The war had left physical, emotional, and psychological scars that would take generations to overcome. For some, the Reconstruction period was a time of hope, a time to rebuild and start anew. For others, it was a time of humiliation and loss. The struggle for racial equality, for economic stability, and for a truly united nation continued long after the guns fell silent. The Civil War had ended, but its legacy, its scars, its unanswered questions, its promises left unfulfilled lived on. The war had redefined the country, but the full impact of that transformation would take decades to fully reveal itself. The emotional and psychological wounds of the war were not something that could be healed quickly. They would shape the course of the nation's history for years to come, and in many ways they still do. The aftermath of the Civil War was not just a time of rebuilding, it was a time of reckoning, a time of coming to terms with the profound costs of a conflict that had torn the country apart and forced it to confront its own soul. The Civil War, in the aftermath of its devastating conclusion, set the stage for a long and ongoing struggle to fulfill the promises made by the nation's founding documents, promises of liberty, equality, and justice for all. While the formal end of the war brought about significant legal changes, particularly the abolition of slavery, the road to realizing the full ideals of the American Revolution was far from over. The war had forced America to confront its own contradictions. On the one hand, the country had fought to preserve a union built on the ideal of freedom. On the other hand, it had maintained an institution of slavery for centuries. The war's end, then, was not the end of America's struggles for justice and equality. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter in a far longer, more painful journey. For African Americans, the Civil War-esque conclusion marked the legal end of slavery, but it did not signal the immediate achievement of true freedom or equality. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 abolished slavery, but it left millions of freed people in a world where they had no legal rights, no property, and no means to sustain themselves. While emancipation was a monumental step forward, it did little to address the social and economic systems that had propped up slavery in the first place. The freedmen and women were left to navigate a world that was still deeply entrenched in racist ideologies, where their very presence in society was viewed as a challenge to the established order. Despite the promises made by Reconstruction-era policies, the freed people were subjected to new forms of subjugation, sharecropping, disenfranchisement, segregation, and widespread violence. The South, in particular, posed an enormous challenge to the idea of equality. Although the Confederacy had been defeated, the Confederate mindset did not disappear with the signing of the peace treaty. Many Southerners continued to view African Americans as inferior, and their desire to preserve a social order based on racial hierarchy led to the imposition of black codes and later Jim Crow laws. These laws sought to control the movement and behavior of freed blacks, ensuring that they remained at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. The resentment toward the federal government's efforts to rebuild the South was palpable, and many Southerners, particularly the white elite, viewed the Reconstruction policies as an affront to their sense of honor and identity. The rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s and 1870s was a direct response to the perceived threat posed by the newfound freedom of African Americans through intimidation, violence and terror, these groups sought to maintain the status quo and prevent the advancement of black rights in the North, while the abolition of slavery was widely celebrated. The question of racial equality remained unresolved. The war had united the North to preserve the Union, but it had not fully united the North on the issue of race. While many Northerners supported abolition, a significant portion of the population harbored deep-seated prejudices against African Americans. The idea of racial equality was still controversial, even in the states that had abolished slavery decades earlier. The North's own issues with racism were revealed through practices like segregation, discriminatory labor policies, and resistance to black migration. While African Americans were free in the legal sense, they were still seen as unequal by many whites, and their rights were often ignored or minimized. The notion of full integration into society, of black Americans achieving the same political, social, and economic rights as white Americans, was met with resistance at every level. The political landscape of the post-war era was also fraught with tension. The struggle for civil rights was far from over, and it would be decades before African Americans achieved even partial equality under the law. The period of Reconstruction, which sought to reintegrate the Southern states into the Union and secure rights for freedmen, was marked by both progress and setbacks. The establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which aimed to assist former slaves in their transition to freedom, was a step forward, but its efforts were undermined by white resistance and a lack of funding. The 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to African Americans, were groundbreaking, but they were not enough to dismantle the structures of racism and oppression that had been deeply ingrained in American society for centuries. The political and legal battles for African American rights continued for many years after the Civil War. In the South, despite the abolition of slavery, black people were systematically excluded from the political process through voter suppression tactics like poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. These tactics were designed to disenfranchise black voters and ensure that political power remained firmly in the hands of white Southerners. Even in the North, African Americans faced obstacles to full participation in political and public life. It would take the rise of the civil rights movement in the 20th century, nearly 100 years after the war, to secure the legal victories that would begin to make good on the promises made in the wake of the Civil War. In addition to race relations, the war's aftermath forced the country to grapple with its economic future. The Southern economy, once reliant on slave labor and cotton production, was left in ruins. The war had destroyed much of the South's infrastructure, railroads, farms, and factories, and left the region with a depleted workforce. While the North emerged from the war with its industrial base intact and a growing economy, the South was left struggling to rebuild. Many Southern landowners turned to sharecropping, a system that trapped both black and white farmers in cycles of poverty. The economic devastation in the South, combined with the entrenched racism, made it difficult for the region to recover quickly, and the long-term economic disparities between the North and South would persist for generations. The war also left lasting scars on the American psyche. The deep divisions between North and South and between white and black Americans were not easily healed. For many Southerners, the war remained a source of pride despite the loss. The lost cause narrative, which romanticized the Confederate cause and portrayed the South as defending its way of life, gained traction in the post-war years. This narrative sought to downplay the central role of slavery in the war and instead emphasize the valor and nobility of Confederate soldiers. For many white Southerners, embracing this narrative was a way to reconcile with the defeat and preserve a sense of identity. However, this narrative was built on a false foundation, and its persistence only reinforced the racial divisions that had defined the nation for so long. For African Americans, the Civil War had been a fight for freedom, but it was also a fight for dignity and the chance to build a future on equal footing with white Americans. The promises of the war, freedom, justice, and equality, were far from fully realized in the years that followed. The journey toward full equality would take many more years of struggle and sacrifice. While the Civil War had marked a pivotal moment in American history, it was by no means the end of the country's racial and social struggles. The fight for civil rights, for true equality before the law, would continue, with the civil rights movement of the 20th century serving as a critical turning point in the long march toward justice. In many ways, the Civil War was not just a struggle for the preservation of the Union, but a battle for the soul of America. The war tested the nation's commitment to its founding principles, and though the Union was preserved and slavery was abolished, the promises of liberty and equality remained unfulfilled. The legacy of the war is not just in the legal changes it brought about, but in the long, difficult journey to create a more just and equal society. The Civil War may have ended in 1865, but the fight for freedom, for equality, and for the true realization of the American dream is still ongoing. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and sub Cribs.